if an animal dies, like without these bugs and detritivores, that animal carcass will not decompose as quickly. Our compost heaps are full of detritivores, worms and mollusks and springtails and millipedes, and it's just like it's a fascinating macro world, and I think having a terrarium can really highlight that. And you can just see these animals go about their lives, and I just think that's infinitely fascinating.
If you have wanted to start a very small garden, one that is enclosed and probably inside your home, called a terrarium, well, this is the week for you. We have Ben Newell on the show. He's the founder of Worcester Terrariums, huge social media following. I found you, I think, via our mutual friend Alessandro, aka Spicy Mustache Ben, and your content that you put out is super inspiring. I've never really gotten into terrariums myself. We were just talking. I had some like sea monkeys as a kid, which isn't really a terrarium, I don't think. So it's awesome to have you on the show. I'm excited to learn about terrariums myself. I know everyone listening probably is too.
Amazing. Thanks for having me, man. I'm super excited to chat.
So how did this all begin for you? Like, were you into this ever since you were a little kid, or when did it spark?
No, so I kind of wish I could tell people a romantic story that I'd been interested in plants since I was young. But to be honest, for me, it really started when I was 22. So I was going through a difficult period in my life, and I was lucky enough to land a job working with a 3-year-old child. So I was his one-to-one support worker. And part of his daily routine was to take the compost from the classroom to the bin. And he hated doing this. Man, he was like kicking and screaming. It was like 20 steps. But I became really interested in the composting process. And right next to the school I was working at was a vegetable garden. So I put my name down on the plot, and within a week, I had a vegetable garden. It was like 1/16 of an acre, and I had no idea what to do with it. And I kind of I got the help of my builder friend Matt, and for the next 5 years, we just sort of learned as we went along. Watched some of your videos, learned a lot through books, and it was at this stage in my life that I realized I was really interested in plants, and I was just seeking out as many horticultural hobbies as possible. And the one that really stuck with me was terrarium building. But back then there wasn't like a whole lot of information online about them. So my early attempts didn't really turn out so well. But through persistence, they eventually got to a stage where they were working. And yeah, like here I am today, working as a full-time content creator who makes videos about terrarium building.
Yeah, it's a wild story. It's funny. You said you got into it around 22. I want to say for me, gardening was somewhere around that time, maybe 23 or 24 is when I really got into it, and didn't grow up gardening either. What about terrariums specifically hooked you? And maybe also for those who don't know, because to me, there's like terrariums, vivariums, paludariums. There's all these arium suffix words. And I'd love to know just the difference between all those different methods.
Yeah, so I think there was something just quite enchanting about these strange-looking plants in glass containers, and the fact it was its own sort of micro ecosystem really appealed to me. There are lots of different types of terrarium, like the ones you just mentioned. So a terrarium comes from terra, the word earth, and it essentially is just the plants within a container. Vivarium is the same thing, but with an animal inside. So if you imagine those slightly larger tanks that perhaps house a gecko or a dart frog or something, and a paludarium combines like aquatic aspects from an aquarium with the terrestrial aspects from a terrarium. So you tend to have like a maybe perhaps the front bit is like water with some fish in and some aquatic plants, and then further back you have the terrestrial aspect. So you have the terrestrial plants and maybe even an animal in there too, like a gecko or something.
Sure. Are there other sort of arium styles that we didn't discuss just now?
There's something called a riparium, which is it's meant to basically simulate the area where water meets land. So that sort of marshy area contains bog plants, and they're quite impressive. I've not had a go at making one though, because it's just of the sheer sort of like complexity of actually doing that. Because as soon as you add water to something, you have to have the sort of the tech around it to keep it clean. And I think what really appeals to me with terrarium building is the simplicity of it. So you can turn something like, I don't know, a £10 or $10 acrylic box into a terrarium. And I really like that access point, because I think for kids especially, you know, you don't have to spend a lot of money and you can create something really quite beautiful.
Yeah, there's something so pleasing, I guess, visually about a well-designed terrarium, almost as a piece of art in the home. I was at a fellow kind of creator's house recently named Hypotech, who makes mechanical keyboards. I kind of got really into mechanical keyboards recently, and turns out he's a big plant guy, and he has, I guess it would be a vivarium because he's got poison dart frogs in
Oh
there,
yeah.
along with a bunch of plants. And he does have the whole, like, there's a fogging system because the frogs need, of course, the moisture from the air and all that. And so there is quite a bit of tech on it, but it just aesthetically, even if you didn't care about the plants or the animals, which of course both of us did, it just looks like a beautiful piece of art that brings the home to life.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the range of plants you can grow in a terrarium it's unbelievable. There are like micro orchids, there are, you know, tiny little terrestrial plants that grow no larger than a few centimeters, and actually displaying those is what I really love to do. And I combined with the animals, you know, I just showed you the praying mantis before this call.
Yeah.
It's just a truly fascinating hobby, and I kind of wish I'd known about it when I was young, because like a young me would have been absolutely just enthralled with this.
Oh man, me too. I mean, I used to collect bugs as a kid. I used to sort of like dead and alive. I used to collect coins and rocks and stuff. So like I was fascinated with the natural world, but didn't have a garden, and didn't really connect
Same.
directly to plants. But terrariums probably would have been my gateway drug into a world, hopefully in the future, of gardening if I had gotten into it when I was younger. Is it hard to get into, though? Is it intimidating? 'Cause, you know, when people think about a garden, they're like, I just don't know where to begin. Like, is it the same with terrariums or no?
I think initially it can seem that way, but I really try to simplify it for people. So, you know, you can get like a leftover jar, collect some, buy some terrarium soil, because it's really important to get the soil right. And then, you know, visit your local plant shop and just buy, you know, a small amount of plants, and you can create something there and then. So I think as far as horticultural niches go, I don't know of one that has an easier access point. I think anything can seem daunting when you first start, but I think terrarium building, at least it's inexpensive. I mean, you can take it to the high end and buy expensive equipment and plants and animals, but actually you could do something for under $10 easily, or even free.
Oh, wow.
If
Wow. Okay. Well, we're going to talk about how we can do some entry level terrariums, but I am kind of curious if you're watching the podcast on the Beet YouTube channel right now, guys, you can see Ben's background. There's probably 15 terrariums, something, no more than
Yeah.
that, 20 maybe.
Yeah, I've turned the lights off because they were flickering on that end, but I think I've probably got, I don't know, maybe about 30 behind me at the moment.
Yeah. And so I'm kind of curious, like, what's the most extra fancy, deluxe terrarium that you have? Like, what's the most crazy you've gone?
The most crazy I've gone without doubt is the BiOrb Earth. So it's like, I think it's around $2,000 if you were to buy it.
Ooh.
But it has its own fogging system, heating system. You can set it to rain. You can sort of like pinpoint a specific area in the world, and it like will mimic that climate. And inside,
Wow.
and it's huge. It's huge. Like to carry it, it's a real pain. And we have to move house soon, so I'm dreading that. But it's also got two tiny dart frogs in. They call them thumbnail frogs, so they don't get much bigger than your thumb.
Yeah.
So yeah, they live in this huge BiOrb Earth, and that without doubt is the most sort of like complex one that I've got.
Wow. So I'm looking at the BiOrb Earth right now, guys. This thing is crazy. I can't even believe it's like a whole world inside this. I don't know. It reminds me of like you watch a sci-fi movie and like the spaceship has all the life systems in place. Like that's
Yeah.
exactly what you're looking at here, but a tiny little thing. You had this BiOrb Earth, this crazy expensive terrarium, but also there's terrariums you can build literally for $0 or $10. And I was kind of curious, maybe we could go through two or three of these designs that you've come up with because you've put some videos out on this in the past that people could just kind of get a taste for what terrariums are like.
Yeah, sure. So I think I really like these sort of square containers. So for those of you who can't see, it's literally like a glass, square cuboid shaped container filled with a little bit of moss just on the bottom. And then I've used one kind of plant. So you see that large leaf one at the back.
Yeah.
That's a plant called Syningia muscicola, and it doesn't grow any bigger than just a few centimeters. So actually, that was super cheap to make. It was like it would be the equivalent of perhaps $10 to $15. And I think what's really a fun aspect of terrarium building is like you can personalize them. So as a kid, I was obsessed with dinosaurs, and through creating videos, I was like, I don't know, how can I access more people? So using dinosaurs, dinosaur figurines, I mean, like they're super tiny. Like my friend 3D prints these and paints them.
Oh, that's so cool. It's like a little prehistoric scene in what Ben's showing on the video version.
Yeah, and some of the dinosaurs have fallen over, but this terrarium has a super tiny opening, so you have to like use tweezers to get them in there. But anything that's clear and that can hold humidity can potentially be used as a terrarium. So even something like a Tic Tac box,
Oh,
a
wow.
jam jar, and it's just about sort of choosing the right plants to go inside it. You know, moss. A lot of mosses grow super slow; they stay small, and a small Tic Tac box with some moss in is quite a curious thing. It looks quite unusual. So it's a really, and actually when I go to the shop now, even looking at spice jars, like one of the projects in the book was a spice jar terrarium, because I think it's a really fun project for, I don't know, like families to do at the weekend, to repurpose spice jars or kilner jars or something. And then there is the bug element. If people want to add bugs to their terrariums, we have to be a little bit selective about which bugs we use. But like smaller terrariums like this size, which I don't know, is perhaps 10 centimeters high and 7 centimeters wide, we have tiny bugs called springtails, which actually they're in the garden already, but we would buy specific springtails super cheap from reptile stores, and you can add a teaspoon in there, and then these springtails will call that place home. And I think that's a really fascinating aspect of terrarium building. And they actually have a role to play. So they feed on mold and decaying matter. And the terrarium actually provides a near perfect home for them.
Yeah. Yeah. The thing that really excited me when I first started binging, I'll be honest, I binged quite a bit of your videos in a row. And I got into the springtails and the isopods that you kept adding in. And it got me thinking. I was like, well, obviously you would have to add those if you wanted a self-sustaining or stable, I suppose, terrarium ecosystem, right? And so the springtails and the isopods basically act as like a decomposition function in that system,
Yeah.
right?
I think it opens up a really great conversation about detritivores and their importance, just not just in a terrarium, but in our world. If an animal dies, like without these bugs and detritivores, that animal carcass will not decompose as quickly. Our compost heaps are full of detritivores, worms and mollusks and springtails and millipedes, and it's just like it's a fascinating macro world. And I think having a terrarium can really highlight that. And you can just see these animals go about their lives, and I just think that's infinitely fascinating.
You know what has captivated me, dude, is the fact that in a garden environment, let's say these isopods, or we call them roly-polies or pill bugs over here, you might sometimes get frustrated by them because perhaps there's a little bit too much detritus in that particular area, and they'll congregate and they'll start to breed. And then actually they will start to nibble on your root crops and eat a bit. And so sometimes I find gardeners can be a little bit frustrated by them in high amounts. And they'll go, hey, how do I get rid of these things? It's like, well, it's not really about getting rid of them. It's more about having an adequate balance of them in an ecosystem. But then when you get into the terrarium world, and I was so fascinated by this, not only are they beloved, they're necessary, but then they're sort of been bred and customized. And I didn't
Yeah.
realize there was this deep world of basically custom isopods or custom roly-polies. And I'm browsing actually right now. I mean, there's ones with crazy names, crazy colors. One's called like dairy cows. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm sure you know much more about this than I do.
Yeah, and I mean, the isopod community is huge. People, they collect rare species from around the world, they breed them, and like a single isopod can sell for $50 or $100 because they're like highly sought after. I had a species recently which was sent to me. They're called ember bees, and each one I think is around $30 to $40, and they're beautiful. They're really quite stunning, and they don't look like your average roly-poly in the garden. These have like crazy patterns on them. Some of them have like spikes on them, but the isopod community is huge and booming.
Wow.
Like I didn't realize just how popular it's actually more advanced, I would say, than the terrarium hobby itself. Like the isopod communities online are giant.
I honestly, I knew it was a thing. I'm now starting to realize I didn't even know how deep it goes. I'm on a site called frogdaddy.net right now, looking
Yeah,
at, you know that? I'm looking at some crazy ones. And then I just Googled the one that you mentioned, the red ember bee. This is a $250 isopod, which is crazy. I don't know. Maybe it's a rare one. This is on tropicalisopods.com, the best collection of isopods on the internet. And wow, there's different species, and then there's sort of, in the plant world, I guess you'd say cultivars, but here you'd say breeds, I suppose, of those species. And are people then self-selecting for specific traits and breeding out, like, much like you maybe would with like a dog or koi or something like that? Like, I want one a little bit more yellow. I'm going to keep breeding this line out and create a new, variant.
Yeah, I'm not sure around the sort of breeding of them. I think actually a lot of people are like searching for them in the wild, so that does pose like ethical questions. But I do think hobbies like this, with captive breeding programs, stop a lot of that. But there's no doubt that people are sort of on the search for rare isopods. Some species were only discovered in recent years, and then people have sort of collected them, bred them, and then brought them into the hobby. But it's wild. There are so many, and I think a lot of the high price point is around how difficult they are to breed. So some species will breed very quickly.
It's just
it's wild.
fascinating. I mean, it's just fast. I'm looking at one called Armadillium vulgare Pike Road, and it looks like you know how bowling balls have that sort of like oil slick kind of swirly pattern in them. This one kind of looks like that. This is crazy. Okay, so we're getting into isopod territory, maybe a little bit too deep right now, but so there's springtails, there's isopods, there's tiny terrariums. We talked about the Tic Tac box. It seems like it's just use up like a jar of spices or a jam or a mason jar in your kitchen, and those are all suitable, right?
As long as it's clear and it lets light through, absolutely. I mean, I think people can think of terrariums as being shade loving, but like any plant, they need light, just sort of varying amounts.
Ben, we've talked a little bit about just overall terrariums, different types, how to make small ones. We went really deep on isopods, but how does someone just make their first? Let's just imagine I have a simple mason jar. What do I need to do, and how do I do it, in what order?
Okay, so I would break it down into as simple a process as possible. So you want to look for something, so assuming you're not going to make your own substrate because you'd need to buy lots of different components, the first thing you're going to need to buy is something called an ABG mix. Now, this is a soil mix based on something created by the Atlanta Botanical Gardens, and it's like the gold standard of terrarium soil. Made up of lots of different components, but essentially it's a really good terrarium soil. It's airy, it holds on to moisture, but also doesn't become compacted. So you will simply add a few handfuls of that into the mason jar, maybe until it's quarter full. For aesthetic purposes, I always arrange the soil on a gradient. So you pick a front, make it lower at the front and then higher at the back. In terms of plants, so there are many plants you can use in a terrarium. Like there's an infinite amount. I feel like moss almost like brings the whole thing together. So what I would do then, if we're talking about a mason jar which has a small surface area, I would perhaps use some moss. You can buy something called cushion moss, which is widely available. And I would cover the surface in cushion moss. So what you're going to end up with is something that almost looks like a tiny lawn. I can show you just in that terrarium I showed you last time. You can sort of see it here. If you ignore the dinosaurs and the plants, what you actually have is like a very neat, almost like a lawn, right?
Yeah. So for those who can't see, Ben's showing me a little cube, and there's a gradient of soil going from front to back, and then kind of like a fluffy green tufted kind of lawn look, which is all the moss, right?
Yeah.
And that also helps to kind of adhere the soil together and create like a stable surface.
You can just create a terrarium with moss, but the plants will go in on top of that. What I'd do next is I would pick some plants. Now this is, it's not really a difficult thing to do. It's kind of up to you. But if I were to pick 3 plants that work really well, are cheap and easy to get hold of, I'd probably look at something like a Phytonia. So they're also known as nerve plants. They're very common. Or I would look at something called Pilea glauca, also known as aquamarine. These are widely available in plant shops in the UK. I'm not sure about the US, but I'm sure it's probably the same. And what I would do with these plants, I wouldn't plant them whole. So I wouldn't remove the plant from its pot and then put it into the terrarium. What I would do is take rootless cuttings. So you would almost find a stem with maybe 2 leaf nodes on it. And then you would cut below the second leaf node. So you're left with a cutting. And then with that cutting, I would push that into the moss. So that cutting is then going to grow in the terrarium. Something I'm always asked is, it doesn't have roots. Is it actually going to work? But once it's in the terrarium, transpiration from the leaves slows right down. So it gives the plant a chance to grow a root system. And not only does it stay smaller for longer while it develops roots, but because it's small, it fits with the scale of the container. And that's essentially it. When you put the lid on, there's a bit of a myth in the terrarium world where I think a lot of people who sell terrariums will call them self-sustaining ecosystems, and you never have to do anything to them. I almost feel like that's a bit of a buzz term. So terrariums are absolutely ecosystems. Within that container, the humidity is high. It creates like an almost tropical environment. But the problem is these plants grow in parts of the world where it's very humid. The terrarium provides that humidity, but in nature, plants have access to infinite amounts of air. And in a terrarium, if you just leave it closed, it's going to become quite stagnant and you might have issues with mold. So what I advise everybody to do if they have a terrarium is to open the lid from time to time. We don't have to be like militant about it, but at least a couple of times a week just to freshen that air up. Or better yet, you can buy containers that already have holes in them. If you use plastic, you can drill holes in it. But airflow is absolutely important to terrarium health.
Yeah, that's probably was my biggest question is, can you just close the lid, never open it again, and have this beautiful system play forever? And I've always thought, it feels like the answer would be no, just based on what I know of, garden ecosystems. And maybe the better you set up the initial conditions, perhaps the bigger and more diverse the ecosystem inside the terrarium, the longer you could get away with that. But regardless, at some point, you're going to want to have to actively manage from the outside, right? And it sounds like that's the case.
Exactly. And I think there is one terrarium I've heard of, which you mentioned before, which is the that huge one, which is over 60 years old. But that is an anomaly. It's very rare that happens. More often than not, terrariums will reach a stage where they need to be redone or at least have maintenance performed on them. And I kind of want to sort of shift the focus, from self-sustaining to, okay, terrariums have a certain lifespan, right? Like a houseplant in a pot does. Eventually, we're going to have to redo this. We're going to have to take the plant from its pot, with a houseplant, I mean, refresh the soil, perhaps put it into a larger pot. With a terrarium, like, I kind of view it in the same way. There might come a stage where we need to remove some of these plants, trim them, replace them, or maybe even redo it entirely. But to me, that's actually an enjoyable part of the hobby. Nothing is permanent, right? Nothing's going to last forever. So embracing that sort of change, and I think is the really enjoyable part of the hobby.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it makes sense. You tend to your garden, and then I guess houseplants to some degree, you tend to, I would say, slightly less, and maybe terrarium somewhere in the middle of that, or maybe even slightly less. But the tending to me, is part of the hobby, and that's why when I see a lot of systems that talk about growing plants on autopilot, like there's a lot of these hydroponic systems that are out there. I don't think they're necessarily a bad thing. I think they're great devices, but they're to me not for someone who's really wanting to plug into the garden actively. It's almost like you're treating the plants almost as an appliance, and you're getting a piece of produce out of them, and you don't really care how it goes, which is fine. It's like a different type of gardening. To me, like if you're going to go through the world of the work of building a terrarium, you kind of want to monitor it. Oh, I'm going to move this around, or I'm going to change this plant, or this or that. So it makes total sense to me. Okay, so can we talk about adding different animals to your terrarium? We went kind of deep on isopods and springtails, but there are more. Let's say you have your first terrarium. It's like moss. It's a Fittonia, the nerve plant. There's a little bit of texture going on, but you haven't added any animals at all. How would someone start?
With a mason jar, the only thing I would add in that would be springtails, because these animals need a slightly different container. So isopods need airflow. Well, so do springtails too, but we can get away with springtails with sort of burping the jar every few days. But for a specific terrarium, like each one is different. So isopods will require a slightly different container to, say, a praying mantis or a jumping spider. But with isopods, you essentially, you're going to need, so the setup is the same with the soil, but you're going to need a lot of leaf litter, because these animals live in the leaf litter. They burrow into the soil. They also like to feed on rotting wood. So adding a lot of that is really beneficial to the isopods. You're going to have to be a little bit more careful around plant species. So I kind of figured out through making these terrariums that isopods will not eat ficus species, so the fig family, because they exude that milky latex when cut, and it's irritable. So I've noticed that isopods tend to avoid those, and the fig family is amazing. There are so many like tropical ficus species that the leaves are like a few centimeters big, and they will creep around the terrarium, and it looks really fantastic. So they avoid eating those. There's also certain ferns. So we have types of Boston fern, which I think the leaves are quite tough, so they're unappealing to the isopods. Because, as you know, as a gardener, isopods can nibble on things. And it's the exact same in a terrarium. But I think offering them better food sources is the key in a terrarium to prevent that. And you can even feed them like vegetables and stuff, like small amounts of vegetables. They love it. My isopods love banana skin and squash, and cucumber and apple. So that's also like a fun thing to do as well.
Will they eat it relatively quickly? Like if you gave them, I don't know, maybe a marble sized piece of squash, how quickly would that go away?
It really depends on the numbers. But if you had like a colony of, say, 50 dairy cow isopods, that marble would last, I don't know, I'm going to guess like 6 to 7 hours, because squash is like quite tough, like winter squash. But they also, they will eat protein sources too. So we will occasionally feed them freeze-dried minnows, and because the population I have is quite big, that minnow is gone very quickly. I had a dart frog die.
Wow.
And I put the dart frog inside, and within a few hours it was gone.
The whole frog.
Yeah, I mean, it was a small frog, but it's
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, this is
Were
what
the
they do.
bones left even, or no?
They consume the bones too.
Wow. Wow.
Mm.
That is wild. And then they're excreting effectively, kind of like a worm might excrete worm castings. It's some sort of pretty broken down, nutritious waste, right?
Yeah, and it just helps, it keeps the terrarium more alive. It creates more of an ecosystem because you have that process, even away from, say, feeding them, like as leaves fall or things start to decompose in the terrarium, the isopods feed on it, create waste, which is good for the soil and good for the plants. Like the waste is more accessible to the plants.
Hmm.
So yeah, and I think that's like a really interesting area of terrarium building because you can build something quite big, and again for quite cheap. You can pick up a glass fish tank from online for super cheap with a lid,
Hmm.
and you can effectively create like a whole ecosystem in there with animals that each have a role to play.
Yeah.
And even with like the dart frogs, when they go to the toilet, the isopods break that down even further, and
Mm.
it becomes like more of a cycle.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so let's move to the larger animals, like frogs. Is there like ever a lizard in the mix in some of your terrariums, or is that too big? How does that work?
Yeah, so I have one crested gecko. They're quite a common species of gecko to keep. There are boreal, so they live in trees. So you need to craft the vivarium around their needs. So you want lots of branches, lots of foliage where they can hide. And yeah, they're pretty interesting. I think the geckos are really fascinating. Something I'm really, really into are the tiny glass frogs. They're super cute, man. They just look like Kermit, and they come out at night. They have a transparent underside, so when they're up against the glass, you can see their digestive tracts.
Oh,
And
wow.
again, these are arboreal animals. They like live above streams. They live high up in the foliage, and they feed on tiny flies. Yeah, just a really interesting aspect of the hobby.
Yeah. And then you've got your mantis that I think I've seen in quite a few of your videos, the famous
Mm.
mantis. How do they work in the rest of the ecosystem inside a terrarium?
So I think with a mantis, you would, because they're carnivores, you wouldn't want to house it with anything else.
Mm.
They are surprisingly cheap as well. Like in the UK, you can pick up a praying mantis for under £10, and they're really fascinating creatures. Like this mantis looks like a flower petal, so it's camouflaged, and it literally sits still, just waiting for something to move in front of it, and then it gets its prey.
Yeah.
But because like this particular mantis is they're from Malaysia, so they need that humidity, making a terrarium like a perfect home for them. But there are specific sort of container requirements for that. So with a praying mantis, it needs to have, absolutely must have air holes like at the bottom and the top, so you have that airflow.
Mm.
And because praying mantis also like to hang upside down from the top of the container, there needs to be like a mesh that they can hang from. And actually, praying mantids are unbelievably interesting animals because as they go through their lives, they shed their exoskeleton as they get bigger. And yeah, and then at the end, if the male and female mate, very often the female will eat the male.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I think
Brutal.
it's really it's super brutal. But it's fun to sort of just create terrariums for these animals. And yeah, and I think it's a really I really get a lot of enjoyment out of that, and I like that it's becoming more popular.
I'm getting a bit of a preemptive high of the excitement of what I'm about to do because I've thought for so long, actually. I a long, long time ago, pretty much when I was first starting out epic gardening, I went over to New York, to Brooklyn, and I hung out with Summer Rain Oaks, and her channel was called Homestead Brooklyn at the time. She has a different channel now. And she had, I believe, for some reason, I feel like she called it a something different. It was a different type of arium. It was like some very bespoke one, but it was huge. And I got hooked on it at that moment in time, but I just never really for some reason got into it. And so now I'm like making the commitment. And I really want, maybe I'll just start with, I don't know, like, should I just go big from the start, or should I kind of step my way into it cautiously? Because I've got like a shelf over here. I feel like I could put a really cool one on and like light it up and just kind of be able to, because I'm in the office a decent amount of the time. Like I want to interact with it. I want to see it all the time, you know?
Yeah. I think, to be honest, like I would go in between. So something really small requires quite a lot of care, and you need to be more maintenance on it. And something really big, I don't know, it's like it takes up a lot of space, and yeah, and also like I don't know, I feel like the middle area is definitely the place to go. And also with that, like, so looking at I can't see the rest of your office, but in terms of lighting it, because obviously these terrariums need light, you can get like lights that sit directly on top of the terrarium that plug into a plug or a USB, so you can situate these anywhere in your home.
Perfect.
I think, yeah.
Well, if you guys want to see me make one, send me a DM on Instagram at Epic Gardening. Tell me what I should put in my terrarium, because I am going to do it. We've talked about how to get started in this incredible hobby, this incredible craft. Now let's talk about how to make sure that you stay in the hobby and you're caring for your terrarium. We talk about this a lot, Ben, in the world of gardening, when someone kind of goes gung-ho into the garden season one, and then, oops, I grew too much. I'm having to keep track of everything in August when maybe I'm a little burnt out on the garden. And so I kind of want to make sure that people don't have that happen to them in terrariums. And so after you've built one, maybe you have a couple, do you have like a daily maintenance, weekly maintenance routine that you're going through?
Not really. So I think with a terrarium, unlike a house plant, which, you know, you probably have to water like a certain amount of times in a month or something, some terrariums can go months or even years without an extra drop of water. Like, each one is different. I think it's really important to get that across. I would keep an eye on them. So if you've made one terrarium, like, I would definitely keep an eye on it, because one of the things you have to get right is the watering. So first and foremost, you don't water to a schedule. So, you know, once a week, twice a week, once a month. Like, if you water to a schedule, what's going to happen is you're going to overwater. And in a terrarium, there are no drainage holes. So if you overwater, your soil will become waterlogged, it will become anaerobic, and it will start to smell. And other than bog plants, no plants really like growing in that environment. So watering is really important. Soil obviously is really important, but assuming we've used that ABG mix, then you're good to go. But light is the really difficult one to try and explain to people, because, you know, terrariums, these plants actually live in the forest floor layer or understory layer of the rainforest, where they're not being blasted with sun. So how does that translate to our homes? Like, a good rule of thumb is to allow the terrarium to see as much of the sky as possible without sitting in the sun, because, you know, walking into a greenhouse on a hot day, it becomes incredibly hot. And if the direct sun hits your terrarium, that's exactly what will happen. It will greenhouse effect, and it will reach 40, 50 degrees, and nothing is going to grow. It's just going to cook the contents. So indirect light in the UK, that's like north facing windows, it's perfect. Not everyone is blessed with lots of window space, so you can actually just use a regular warm white LED bulb in a lamp, and it works perfectly well. Like, we're not trying to grow fruiting plants. Like, these are foliage plants or mosses, and they don't need vast amounts of light. However, they do still need some. So yeah, indirect light from windows or artificial light is perfectly well.
You know what's interesting about terrariums, it sounds like, is that, of course, in the garden, you are mostly producing either edible foliage or fruit, and you generally want to give it as much light as you can. Of course, like spinach, maybe not the case, things like that. Then when you get to house plants, we talk a lot about how cramming them up next to a windowsill, even that sometimes isn't enough if you're going for growth and size. And these big houseplants, which a lot of people tend to, especially if you're growing like those aeroids, up poles, etc. But it kind of sounds like with terrariums, you're trying to keep the plants alive and healthy, but you're not necessarily trying to make them absolutely thrive, because then they would start to outgrow their own container. So you're kind of trying to keep them in a bit of a stasis. Yeah.
Yeah, in a way. I think, the further into the hobby people get, there are certain species which literally don't grow higher than an inch or two. So like using those is going to ensure longevity. But like the species I mentioned that we were going to put in that mason jar, like, yeah, I mean, the slower the growth, the better. But again, certain plants grow super slow, certain plants grow super fast. So yeah, I mean, the faster the plants grow, the more maintenance you're going to have to do.
And when we talk about when you actually have to go in and do that maintenance, like you earlier on showed a small cube with a very tiny top hole that I'm assuming even to build it, you kind of had to funnel the ingredients in and place them with tweezers or something. So after it's grown out, how do you then almost like, I guess, surgically care for what's in there? And maybe it's overgrown or you need to clear something out. How do you actually do that?
So aquarium tools are the best because you have long-handled scissors, long-handled tweezers. So like this, they're just like a long, so you can really get into that space.
Long and thin scissors, yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, that's really it. You get in there, you can take cuttings from them. You can use those cuttings again. I think that's another really interesting point about terrarium building is that once the plants have grown and we use cuttings in them initially, once we take more cuttings, they can be used again. So behind me, like there is just a clear plastic tub, and this is just called a propagation box. So whenever I take cuttings from a plant to reduce the waste, and if I'm not going to make another terrarium immediately, I'll just put the cuttings into that propagation box. And all it is a clear plastic box with some terrarium soil in, situated underneath a LED light. And then that essentially is a terrarium, but not one designed for aesthetics.
Yeah, that's actually really smart to do. I saw this idea at a friend's garden that we were touring once. She's a suburban mom who grows like about half of her own produce. And she dedicated one elevated cedar raised bed, maybe about 2 feet by 4 feet. So not too big. And all it was a cuttings box, kind of in part shade. And so every time she did some pruning, if she's like, I might need that again, she would just pop a little bit in and she could then come in and cut out. So she had like bits of basil in there, oregano, dill. She had like banana in there, just whatever. Now, would it all be used? No, but it's kind of like nature's refrigerator, I suppose, to keep something ready in case you need it again, which, yeah, that's a clever idea. Any other like massive mistakes someone could make when caring or trying to build out a terrarium that could kind of just destroy it?
I think over fussing. So if you you created your first terrarium, like it looks great, you're really loving it, and you're just paying it too much attention. I think sometimes like just leaving plants to grow, to bed in a little bit is a really good thing. People can be trigger happy when it comes to watering. I think a really good point, like I'm not sure about how the water is in your area, but here in London, the water is extremely hard. So it's got a high calcium content. It's quite alkaline.
Yeah. Same here, actually.
Yeah. So watering your terrarium with good quality water, like distilled water or even just filtered water, is going to be a vast improvement on that tap water. So yeah, I think not fussing over terrariums is absolutely a big one.
Yeah, probably hard to resist when you've just started the hobby too. I can imagine myself like wanting to go in and change things all the time and having to remind myself to relax. Okay, you do have a book out, Hello Tiny World. Do you want to tell people about that, where people can find you on the internet?
Yeah, so Hello Tiny World came out on May 2nd in the UK and May 14th in the USA. It's basically the book that I wish I had when I first started making terrariums. So it's totally beginner friendly, but also suitable for those further along in the hobby. I break down everything from how to create your own soils. There are 13 projects in there. There's a massive plant list of suitable terrarium plants. It shows you where you can buy them, how to use them. And yeah, as I said, it's the book I wish I had when I first started because I wanted to break everything down into sort of digestible pieces for beginners, because I think it's a wonderfully rewarding hobby, but there's also like a lot of misinformation about terrariums. So I was hoping that this book could, dispel some of those myths and get as many people interested in this as possible.
I can't wait to get my copy. I'm very excited about it. The cover is gorgeous. Thanks for coming on. It's been amazing talking about terrariums with you.
Thanks for having me, man.